In ancient Greek mythology, the Muses were goddesses who inspired artists, scientists, poets, and madmen. If you wanted to be a writer, you had to make friendly with a muse or two. There were 9 of them. They were daughters of Mnemosyne or memory, and each one of them had a different function. Most famous is probably Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. But the muses, to the Greeks, were the fount of thought, the ultimate and most simple answer to that most awful of all writing questions: where do you get your ideas? Nowadays, we tend to no longer personify inspiration in this way. We tend not to think of inspiration as a beautiful woman standing behind our shoulder and whispering in our ear. But our realistic or scientific mindset hasn't made creativity any less mysterious and enigmatic. If anything, it's made the mystery deeper. So, how does one attract and keep and feed their muse? Hi there, I'm Luke Morris. This is Creative Writing Corner. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons below this video so you never miss a writing tip. And today, our lesson is coming from Ray Bradbury's Zen in the Art of Writing. If you've seen my 5 best books on writing video, you'll know this is one of them. And this is from one of the essays in here, which is on how to keep and feed a muse. So, according to Bradbury, the muse is that most terrified of all the virgins. She starts if she hears a sound, pales if you ask her questions, spins and vanishes if you disturb her dress. Basically, finding and holding your muse, like finding and holding happiness, is best done by pursuing something else. If you make the muse the object of your search, just like if you're trying to search for happiness, you'll never find her. The more you try to hold her, the more she'll slip through your fingers. So in order to attract your muse, like attracting anything else, if you're going fishing, let's say, you're going hunting, you're trying to attract any kind of living creature, you must offer food. Bradbury says, in a lifetime, we stuff ourselves with sounds, sights, smells, tastes, and textures of people, animals, landscapes, events large and small. We stuff ourselves with these impressions and experiences and our reaction to them. These are the stuffs, the foods, on which the muse grows. So to clarify, the muse is not an external entity that you hope will someday show up on your doorstep. The muse is in you. Bradbury calls it what is the subconscious to every other man in its creative aspect becomes, for writers, the muse. So the muse is your subconscious, and it is this subconscious entity that gives us beauty, art, and poetry. And poetry, loosely defined as the music of words that give meaning to experience, is ultimately the goal of language, even prose. Bradbury says, when a man talks from his heart, in his moment of truth, he speaks poetry. As we can learn from every man or woman or child around us when, touched and moved, they tell us of something they loved or hated this day, yesterday, or some other day long past. At any given moment, the fuse, after sputtering wetly, flares and the fireworks begin. So, it's in your moment of truth that you're speaking poetry that you are most truly in touch with the muse. Right? When you truly love or hated something at any given time, that's when you are in touch with the muse. So how do we spark this flame? How do we entice our muse? Where does a creative person come up with creative ideas? Bradbury responds, when people ask me where I get my ideas, I laugh. How strange. We're so busy looking out to find ways and means, we forget to look in. So, our greatest ideas and inspirations are already inside us. We already have the material that we need to write. Bradbury defines the muse as a fantastic storehouse, our complete being, all that is most original lies waiting for us to summon it forth. So your whole being, you, everything that makes you you, is your storehouse. The muse is a collection of all of that and also arises from that. So how do we discover our inner muse? There's many different ways. How do we feed this muse, right? How do we offer food for this muse to help this muse grow? Well, one way to discover the inner muse is, as Bradbury says, read poetry every day of your life. Poetry is good because it flexes muscles you don't use often enough. Poetry expands the senses and keeps them in prime condition. Above all, poetry is compacted metaphor or simile. So poetry is imagery. Poetry is compacted comparison. Right? To build on this point, ideas lie everywhere through poetry books, yet how rarely have I heard short story teachers recommend them for browsing? Well, I try to recommend poetry to my students whenever I can, but even I, as a creative writing teacher, probably don't have my students reading enough poetry. I, as a creative writer myself, may not read enough poetry. I read poetry regularly, but I can't say I read it every day. And I'm certainly not much of a poet myself. So this is one of those ideas of Bradbury's I'm going to take to heart to try to build on my enticement for my own muse. But what should we read? What poetry? What poetry? Bradbury asks. Any poetry that makes your hair stand up along your arms. Don't force yourself too hard. Take it easy. So any poetry that speaks to you, any poetry that wakes you up, makes you want to read more. Beyond poetry, what else should your muse eat? Well, Bradbury recommends books of essays. He says, in your reading, and books of essays, this is from any century, books of essays from a whole historical landscape. In your reading, find books to improve on your color sense, your sense of shape and size in the world. Because in order to convince your reader that he is there, you must assault each of his senses in turn with color, sound, taste, and texture. This is how reading essays and other works of nonfiction can help a fiction writer. The most improbable tales can be made believable if your reader, through his senses, feels certain that he stands at the middle of events. He cannot refuse then to participate. The logic of events always gives way to the logic of the senses. So even if your logic is telling you that that can't really happen, if you see, hear, feel, taste, touch, and smell yourself there with the characters in their world, within the world of that story is going to feel real for you, no matter how unrealistic it might be or its concept might be. Okay? So you can make the unbelievable believable. This is why Tolkien is held up as the height of all fantasy authors, because he created his world in so much depth that it reads to us like a real world. We feel like we are there with the characters going through their experiences as we read along with The Lord of the Rings, right? Any good novel does this, but I recommend that because that's one of those novels that's fantasy. He kind of didn't invent the fantasy genre, but he gave it to us the way we have it today. And he made it a household word, household idea. Fantasy is no longer something that is looked down on in the writing world most of the time anyway, because he showed that you can take a fantastic or fantastical idea and turn it into something real that people will commit to and will be real for the people reading it. So then, this is going beyond, of course, fiction and nonfiction, or beyond essays and poetry. You should also read short stories and novels. Bradbury suggests read those authors who write the way you hope to write, those who think the way you would like to think, but also read those who do not think as you think or write as you want to write, and so be stimulated in directions you might not take for many years. In other words, read trash as well as treasure, and both in abundance. Both will teach you about the craft, especially if you read carefully. But if you feed your muse this way, how do you ensure that what she produces, I'm referring to the muse as feminine because traditionally she is, how do you ensure that what she produces is going to be any good or will say what you want to say, what you are trying to put forth. Bradbury says, I believe one thing holds it all together. Everything I've ever done was with excitement because I wanted to do it, because I loved doing it. Because I wanted to do, I did. Where I wanted to feed, I fed. So you find your food, the food for your muse, within your own passions, within what you love doing, what you love reading, what you love watching, absorbing. That's where you're going to find your muse. Bradbury goes on, the constant remains, the search, the finding, the admiration, the love, the honest response to materials at hand, no matter how shabby they one day seem when looked back on. So what you love now, don't worry about what's the greatest thing ever written. Don't worry about making all your writing like Shakespeare, especially if you don't like Shakespeare. If you don't like Shakespeare, you shouldn't be writing like Shakespeare. If you do write Shakespeare, you still probably shouldn't be writing like Shakespeare, because nowadays people don't speak like Shakespeare. They don't think like Shakespeare. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn from reading Shakespeare. You can learn a lot about writing and about the human experience from reading Shakespeare. So feed your brain with what you want to feed it with, okay? And continue that search, continue reading, continue feeding your mind. This goes back to that reading like a writer episode I did a little while ago. Because feeding a muse is an active and ongoing, never-ending process. Bradbury calls it the continual running after loves, the checking of these loves against one's present and future needs, the moving on from simple textures to more complex ones, from naive ones to more informed ones, from non-intellectual to intellectual ones. Nothing is ever lost. So, just because you might not like reading the same books or watching the same TV shows now that you did when you were 10, doesn't mean that that didn't help inform your experience and your understanding of story and your understanding of the world in some way, and that you can't someday go back to it if you want to, say, write children's work of yourself, or you're just trying to dig up more ideas for stories. So find the loves and passions from your childhood. Trace how your loves and passions have evolved or transformed over time, and use that transformation, those ideas, those loves and passions as your guiding light for the kinds of stories that you'd like to tell now. To feed your muse, then, you should always have been hungry about life since you were a child. You need to have wanted to learn, wanted to develop, wanted to grow. You've wanted life. That's what story is all about, right? Story is about communicating life. And by living well, by observing as you live, by reading well and observing as you read, you have fed your most original self. By training yourself in writing, by repetitious exercise, imitation, good example, you have made a clean, well-lighted place to keep the muse. In other words, you've done your absorption, your education, and you've done your work. So be certain of this: when honest love speaks, when true admiration begins, when excitement rises, when hate curls like smoke, you need never doubt that creativity will stay with you for a lifetime. The core of your creativity should be the same as the core of your story and of the main character in your story. What does your character want? What is his dream? What shape has it, the dream, and how expressed? That's your story in a nutshell, right? That's any story that you're telling at any particular time. So your story is your character's story. Your story feeds in, your personal story feeds into every story that you write. Doesn't mean you want to write the same story every single time, but your struggles, your triumphs and defeats, and the triumphs and defeats of others that you've absorbed, both fictional and non-fictional, those all go into the makeup that you are going to pour out of your pen in your final writing work. Once you have this muse in hand, you need never worry about running out of story ideas again. Once your muse is with you, your work becomes more joyous and more productive. You get more written, and your stories improve as you go, and you enjoy doing it more. Bradbury says that to feed well is to grow. To work well and constantly is to keep what you have learned and know in prime condition. Experience, labor. These are the twin sides of the coin, which when spun is neither experience nor labor, but the moment of revelation. So experience, labor, revelation, right? So you've got to get out there. Collect experiences. That's both living life and in your reading, right? In collecting experiences of others and collecting ideas, collecting revelations. You're collecting experiences, putting in your labor, revealing the revelations that await you. Go ahead and do that, and I can't wait to read your work. What does your muse come up with? Again, I've been Luke Morris. This has been Creative Writing Corner. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're looking to improve your fiction writing faster, grab my free guidebook on how to create characters by clicking the link in the description below. Until next time, my friends, good luck and good writing. Right on.